Sup, boys? So this is actually a continuation of a continuation. This video, I actually cut the previous video in half because it was going to be something like 40 minutes long. So to make it a little bit more digestible and a little bit easier to kind of understand and kind of grasp before I dump even more information on you, I split the previous video into two separate videos. So in the previous video, we just got done talking about Swirl and Crystallize. In this video, we're going to go over both Frozen and Shattered, and then we're also going to be talking about Electro-Charged to cap everything off. This should be coming to a close on all of the elemental reaction stuff, and I'm planning on doing a video tying it all together with a elemental mastery versus attack kind of video, just so that we can kind of put a nail in that coffin, hopefully, to kind of, for my own sake, honestly, to figure out which one is probably more worthwhile to build for certain builds and stuff like that. Just as a quick recap of kind of what we've talked about in the series so far, we basically looked at how reactions are actually applied. Whenever you take two elements and you combine them, it creates a specific reaction. We looked at the damage formula and how all of that stuff works out. We ended up looking at the difference between a transformative reaction and a amplified reaction, and then we actually took that a step further and we took a specific look at Crystallize and Swirl in the most recent video. If anything that you hear in this video kind of sounds just completely out of place, like I have no idea what that is, most likely I have covered that in a previous video in the series. There is a playlist that I've been keeping all of these videos kind of clumped together with. I'll try to remember to put that in a card right over here somewhere. I don't know, like right there, maybe right there. Check right here. Is it there? Is it there? Without further ado, if this feels jarring, I'm sorry, but let's go ahead and hop into Frozen.
And no, not the Disney movie.
Frozen, and more specifically Shattered. Quickly, let's go over the Frozen status. So Frozen is essentially Hydro plus Cryo, and it can be in any order of operation for there, as long as Hydro and Cryo are both applied. It doesn't matter which one is the aura and which one is the trigger. When Freeze is applied, it still does end up removing gauge depending on what the aura and the trigger were. So in that sense, if you are looking for a longer freeze, the simplest way to remember how long an enemy is going to be frozen is by taking the lowest unit gauge that you have, and just, so this ends up meaning that if you do a 1U Hydro and a 2U Cryo, or a 2U Cryo and a 1U Hydro, you still end up getting freeze for the same amount of duration, which should be right around 3.5 full seconds. But the reason is because we still do the gauge math to remove gauge from the original aura, but it doesn't really matter which order of operation you apply them. The freeze will only end up lasting for the shortest gauge unit that you have. While the enemy is frozen, they are completely immobile. So we can actually demonstrate this here really quick. So this guy is going to be wet from the ocean and frozen. So he is completely immobile and he cannot move throughout this process. And now he's able to move again. Whenever a reaction comes in contact with an enemy that is frozen, Cryo is considered the dominant unit here. So in an instance where Electro is going to come in contact, you'll notice that Superconduct is the reaction that applies, not Electro-Charged. Now in a scenario where Pyro comes in contact, Melt is the one that actually goes off, because Cryo is the dominant element here. But after that reaction happens, gauge math takes over and it determines how much longer is left on the actual freeze. As long as both Cryo and Hydro have aura left, the enemy will stay frozen. Once either or end up falling off, the enemy unfreezes. Now, on to Shattered. So Shattered is a special type of reaction. It does actually scale off of your elemental mastery. It is going to scale just like a normal transformative reaction would. Shattered is going to be physical damage on top of your normal attack. So you'll notice there that we actually ended up doing not only the 120 in cryo damage, but the 220 in physical damage. So if we apply this here, you'll see he's frozen. He takes 220. He took 220 there. So the coolest thing about Shattered is that essentially it is going to be physical damage. So if your enemy that you're attacking is going to be resistant up against physical damage, you are going to do reduced damage on that. But Shattered actually occurs when a heavy attack ends up hitting a enemy that is frozen. So what's a heavy attack? Well, Heavy attacks are kind of a bunch of different things. It can be mainly hits from claymores. That's kind of the easiest explanation that I can give, but there are some skills that end up being heavy hits as well. Razor's E is a good example. As long as you hold his E, it is going to be a heavy hit. Any kind of geo attack, so just straight up geo damage, is going to be a heavy hit no matter where it comes from. So Ningguang ends up doing heavy hits all throughout. But it is kind of complicated because the aura that is removed whenever we perform Shattered is a little bit different depending on the source of that heavy attack. And there's a lot more research being done on that. So I can't really give exact numbers, but just know that sometimes it removes what feels like half a gauge, where sometimes it feels like it removes up to almost 0.75 of a gauge. Now, even though Shattered is going to be a physical damage that happens after you hit something frozen, you can't actually stick a physical goblet onto a character to get extra damage out of that. Unfortunately, that's not going to be how it works. It literally will only scale based off of your elemental mastery. The higher that you can make your elemental mastery, the more shattered damage you're going to end up doing. Now, one of the coolest things that you can end up doing with Shattered is keeping things frozen if they are innately going to be affected by hydro. Something that's actually really interesting that you can do here is a lot of these enemies can be indefinitely frozen as long as you know how to play around with the internal cooldowns. So internal cooldowns were of course covered in a previous video in this series, but one of the things that we can do is we can actually hit this guy and we can freeze him, wait for the ICD to go away. We can hit him, shatter him, and freeze him all at the same time. Now, of course, this doesn't last forever simply because our E isn't always up, but you can kind of see that there is a way to play around and end up freezing this guy indefinitely. Now, in the scenario where you end up having something that's a heavy hit that is from another element, what ends up happening? So the basic way that this works is that since cryo is the dominant element here, if we do hold E, you'll notice that we get a shattered on the frog. We basically get shattered, which removes the cryo first and just leaves the hydro. And then we end up getting electro-charged. As long as there's not enough gauge left to support the superconduct, we end up going that route. Now the heavy attack there shatters and we still get the crystallize, but you'll notice it's a hydro crystal because of the way that the shattered worked out. I hate the hydro boss. Now, finally, we're going to be talking about Electro-Charged. This reaction itself was the sole reason that I dreaded making this video. So Electro-Charged actually breaks the rules of what we kind of have talked about up until this point, where only one aura element can exist on one single target at any one time. The reason that this is different is because Hydro and Electro in the Electro-Charged scenario exist at the same time on a single target. Now, the way that this is going to go is the enemy or the target is going to either have Hydro or Electro. We are going to apply either Hydro or Electro. Gauge math is still going to happen. Then, similar to how Frozen worked, we end up getting whichever element is going to run out first is going to determine how long Electro-Charged will persist. So if we end up having a offset where Hydro ends up running out after 2 seconds, we end up getting Electro-Charged on that target for an entire 2 seconds, and then only the Electro is left. And the order of operations here is quite important. So we end up having this situation where we have strong elements and weak elements. And the way that we're going to define this is simply as strong elements just have more gauge units than weaker elements. So if we end up having a 1U Hydro and a 2U Electro, the 2U Electro is the stronger element. So in a scenario where the aura element ends up being stronger than the trigger element. So for this scenario, let's say that Electro is already applied to the enemy and it ends up being 2U. And then we apply something of Hydro that is only a 1U. Electro-Charged is actually going to remove roughly 3 seconds or about 180 frames worth of aura every single tick. Now, a tick is going to happen on its own after roughly 60 frames. After 60 frames, we will end up getting a tick of damage or a occurrence of Electro-Charged on the enemy. Then we'll end up getting roughly 180 frames worth of aura removed from the enemy. If there is any aura left, we'll end up waiting another 60 frames and we'll get another tick, and then another 180 frames is removed, and so on and so forth until we drop off at least one of the two auras. On the flip side of that though, if we end up having a weaker aura element, so let's say that Hydro is applied first and it's a 1U, and we apply 2U worth of Electro, we end up getting 5 seconds roughly worth of frames removed, or roughly 300 frames worth of aura removed every tick. So in essence, if we end up having 6 seconds worth of aura remaining on an enemy at the exact frame that Electro-Charged is applied, the gauge math will take over, which means we end up removing however many gauges from the aura, and then we'll end up getting our first tick of Electro-Charged, and then it will end up removing 300 frames worth of aura, which in most scenarios is actually going to remove enough aura to completely remove one of the two auras from the enemy, which means we only end up getting one tick of Electro-Charged. Now, to kind of even break that a little bit, Electro-Charged usually will end up giving you an extra tick whenever the aura actually dissipates from one or the other. So if the aura is actually going to run out, most of the time you'll end up getting a extra tick, or a lot of the research refers to it as a second tick or a bonus tick, and you'll end up getting extra damage on top of that, which already still kind of breaks what we understood about Electro-Charged. So to kind of demonstrate the way that this works, we're gonna come back to this stupid boss here, and we're gonna try and see if we can get some Electro-Charged stuff to work. So Electro-Charged, and you can see that our, oh, there it goes. Electro-Charged, and you got to see the lightning that bounces between the two. And you'll notice that there are ticks between every single hit there. So we apply that, we end up getting ticks of damage every second until one of our elements ends up falling off, and it's gone. So whenever you saw the transfer of the Electro-Charged from one enemy to the other, what ends up causing that is only in a specific scenario where Electro is going to be the second, I guess you could still consider it the trigger element for this specific Electro-Charged scenario, because the enemies around that specific Electro-Charged end up also having Hydro. The Electro-Charged will spread the damage to those, but it doesn't end up spreading any kind of aura. So it's not like it ends up spreading Electro-Charged to those and then they start taking damage every tick as well. It only ends up transferring the initial damage from the initial Electro-Charge that we spawned with that specific Electro. Now, in the scenario where we end up trying to add in more reactions on top of the Electro-Charged, if we end up having Electro-Charged, what you just saw was actually, all right, Electro-Charged, what you see there is not only are we actually doing, I gotta get away so I can explain this. Not only were you seeing overloaded damage because we had a reaction between Pyro and Electro, but you should have also saw vaporized damage because we had a reaction between Pyro and Hydro, which ends up meaning that Electro-Charged still functions as two separate auras on one target whenever we throw a third element, completely arbitrary, of Hydro and Electro into the mix. If we throw Pyro or even Cryo into the mix, you still should end up having a trigger element that triggers reactions based off both Hydro and Electro. So we should end up having some of the most outputted damage over the course of Electro-Charged, if you can kind of imagine a perfect world where Electro-Charged not only ticks down every second, but also ends up having this massive potential of damage whenever you throw in a third element to the mix. If you aren't completely mind blown by all of that, you've probably already been reading the source material for most of this video. But if you are indeed looking for more reading and more research on this, I will leave several links down in the description. One, I'm going to leave a link to the damage calculator that I've used in every video previous to this so that you guys can play around with the reactions and stuff like that if you really care to. The crystallized one is the newest one that I wrote. I'll probably end up deleting this because it was just for my researches. We don't actually need that, so bye-bye to that. And then there's some examples that I used in this video that you guys can kind of check yourself on and stuff like that. Again, the variances of the actual shield strength may be a little bit off, like upwards to 20, maybe 25 points of damage, but it should get you really close in the vicinity of what you should expect your shield to be able to tank. I'm going to leave a link to this Animo Swirl Infusion mechanic breakdown. It kind of goes over pretty much the exact same stuff that I talked about, but it has some nice picture references and a nice table that's sort of hard to understand. This is translated material, by the way. This was originally written in Chinese and then translated, I'm 99% sure, so take that for what it's worth. I will leave a link to this thread, which is the original Chinese theory on Geo in itself and how to calculate your shields. This is where I actually get the shield strengths and stuff like that. Then, of course, I'm going to leave a link to this mega document that the Kaching's main theory crafting library has put together. This has 99% of the information that I've talked about in all of these videos today. There's just a plethora of information. I mean, this is like, look, this is just the table of contents right here. All of these are links that refer to specific topics in this one document, and this document goes on for days, literal days. So if you are interested in information beyond this video, definitely go check this stuff out. It is super, super helpful. It's got a ton of good information in it, and I highly encourage anyone who's interested in knowing these kind of things to go check it out. But outside of that, that's all I've got for today, guys. I probably will end up making a video kind of comparing just attack percents versus elemental reactions and stuff like that, just to kind of get a feel for like what's better. Of course, you know, the main shtick that a lot of people end up saying to go with is like a reaction-based team, but I kind of, you know, for myself, I need to understand it, so I want to do the math myself and kind of figure that out. So that will be the next goal. After that, hopefully this chapter will be closed and we can move on to what I really want to move on after this is some team ideas and theory crafting, like teams and stuff like that. But we'll see where we go. But thank you guys so much for hanging out. Thanks so much for watching. See ya. Major shout out to Cherry Blue, who is a YouTube member.